Cato the Elder has the unenviable distinction of being perhaps the most successful failure in Roman history. Over the course of his career, the staunch conservative ideologue waged a one-man war against the creeping influence of Greek culture and philosophy that Rome's steady stream of overseas conquests were bringing back to the capital. While other members of Rome's elite reveled in the wealth of the East and found themselves drawn to the ideas of these storied civilizations, Cato stood firm against the rising tide of Hellenism. He advocated for Rome's unique religious traditions against the corrosive skepticism of Greek philosophy, as well as for the stern morality and frugal way of life that he believed had been the source of Roman greatness, even going so far as to denounce Greek doctors and to forbid his son from being treated by physicians. Though remembered fondly by later generations as a paragon of old Roman virtues, Cato's failure in his war against Greek influence was so spectacular that though his great-grandson, Cato the Younger, sought to embody the guise of his revered ancestor to advance his reactionary political agenda, the younger Cato was utterly steeped in the thought of the Greek philosophers, even publicly reading Plato's Phaedo prior to his suicide to let his friends know that his immortal soul would survive the death of his body. Ironically, Cato the Elder lived his life much like Socrates, the hero of that dialogue, by performing the same role as the famous Athenian gadfly and constantly goading the Roman elite in a manner akin to how Socrates deliberately provoked controversy in Athens. Like Socrates, Cato was not afraid to stand alone. Indeed, both men seem to have thoroughly enjoyed it. So while Cato's war on Hellenism was doomed to failure from the start by the sheer weight of military, economic, and social forces beyond his control, his one solitary success in shaping the agenda of the Roman Republic came when he harnessed these very forces of history instead of attempting to halt them. Cato took it upon himself to provoke one of the most horrifying massacres in the history of the ancient world, a conflict that is given the deceptively laudatory name of the Third Punic War, but was in reality little more than the wholesale slaughter of a defenseless population for the perceived slights of their ancestors. The war that eradicated Carthage and its people from history and saw Rome crowned as the unquestioned master of the Mediterranean began thanks to the insistence of Cato, who lobbied for the city's destruction by concluding every speech in the Senate with some variation of Carthago Delenda Est, or, furthermore, I believe that Carthage must no longer exist. This appeal resonated with so many because Carthage had, for over a century, loomed large in Rome's collective imagination as a boogeyman and a potential threat to the Republic's dominance. Rome had already fought 2 costly wars with Carthage, and though it had been victorious in both, the specter of the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal and Rome's disastrous defeat at Cannae 6 decades earlier still haunted Rome and reminded it that it was far from invincible. Still, by the outbreak of open hostilities in 149, the 2 states had been at peace for 50 years, and Carthage was no longer the continent-spanning empire that had challenged Rome for supremacy of the Mediterranean. The Second Punic War had ended not just in Carthage's surrender, but in her abject humiliation before the Republic. Carthage had been reduced to a rump state, possessing no army to speak of, and only a token navy to police its sea lanes. Still, even these meager forces were forbidden from waging war without the permission of Rome. Adding insult to injury, Carthage was forced to pay a heavy indemnity of 10,000 silver talents to Rome, a debt that was not cleared until 151. Carthage was still one of the most important ports in the Mediterranean, and by focusing on commerce instead of militarism, it had quickly resumed its position as one of the most prosperous cities on earth. In fact, it was this very prosperity that caused Cato to lust after the wealth of the city after he visited in 153. Bringing back fresh figs from the city, Cato reminded the senators that it was only 3 days' sail from Rome and offered riches beyond their imagining. The avaricious Senate evidently required little prodding to wage a new war on Carthage, as its wealth proved too tempting to pass up. Overt hostility and military posturing began in 149, remarkably soon after Carthage had finished making its indemnity payments to Rome. The Republic had finished bleeding Carthage dry, and now sought to feast upon its corpse. But even though the Romans of this period followed a policy of naked military aggression and expansion, the ideology of the Republic rested on the conviction that it only fought defensive wars, and that it only brought force to bear against those who threatened Rome. With 2,000 years of history between us and the Romans, the flimsy pretext that they used to justify their wars as defensive quickly collapse into nonsensical sophistry. But that doesn't mean we should delude ourselves into thinking the Romans themselves didn't believe at some level that their wars truly were defensive. After all, modern superpowers still justify foreign aggression as defensive in nature, and these weak excuses are widely accepted. There's no reason to believe that the mass of Romans felt any differently about their wars of aggression. Few aspects of Roman civic religion remained as important as claiming a just casus belli, because they believed that this would ensure the gods favored the war. The task of creating the need for an invasion of Carthage fell then to Massinissa, king of Rome's African client state of Numidia. Whether he acted on the instructions of Rome, or simply because he could smell blood in the water, Massinissa began raiding Carthaginian territory, and the powerless Carthaginian state, shorn of all but the most meager armed forces, could do nothing to stop him. The terms of the treaty that ended the Second Punic War dictated that Rome would serve as Carthage's protector. But unsurprisingly, the legions never mobilized in defense of its ancient enemy. Rome was content to let Massinissa harass the Carthaginians, invading their territory, taking off its people as slaves, and stealing crops as well as other valuables, with absolute impunity. When Carthage's pleas for protection continued to fall on deaf ears in Rome, Carthage decided to strike back against Numidia without Roman permission, an act that they knew risked incurring the wrath of Rome, but they truly believed they had no other options. So unbearable were the incursions of the Numidians that had devastated the countryside and made a mockery of Roman claims that Carthage was an independent state. Perhaps the people of Carthage felt that Rome would see reason and understand why they had rearmed, for with the 50-year indemnity repaid, many Carthaginians must have believed that their long national penance for the Second Punic War was finally at an end. Furthermore, Carthage had done nothing to provoke Roman ire over the past 50 years. The city was now devoted to trade and commerce, standing as a monument to the prosperity that came with sustained peace. But this sober, rational analysis of the situation by the Carthaginians failed to account for the deep-seated Roman fear of a Mediterranean rival, and the reality that the ghosts of Rome's humiliation by Hannibal still resonated powerfully within the Roman psyche. Whether motivated by a genuine spirit of reconciliation or by the realpolitik realization that Carthage could no longer stand against Rome, Carthage had spent 50 years laying the groundwork for peaceful coexistence. Perhaps they believed that merely continuing to exist as a nation was enough of a victory after 2 defeats by the legions. If so, they may have been motivated by a sentiment akin to that expressed by the Irish patriot Bobby Sands, who famously said, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children." But the Carthaginians had forgotten that to an enemy driven mad by fear and hatred, any act of resistance or identity, even the smile on a child's face, will be interpreted as an act of war. For thanks to Cato, a public spirit of mass delusion and paranoia gripped Rome, so much so that all Carthaginian actions were viewed as sinister and threatening. We must recall that Cato himself attempted to rally support for the invasion of Carthage by brandishing ripe Carthaginian figs on the floor of the Senate, as if the bountiful harvest was itself evidence of malicious intent. The Romans were masters of the Mediterranean world, protected by an unstoppable military machine, but had convinced themselves that Carthaginian fruit posed a danger to the existence of the Republic. By devoting itself to commerce instead of war, Carthage hoped to shed the bloodletting of the past, but in the warped Roman mind, the wealth of Carthage and its ability to move beyond the conflict was akin to an act of war. Rome was determined to view its old enemy in the most negative light possible, and chased after reasons to fear Carthage where none existed. Though from the outset Rome had fully committed itself to war and the extinction of Carthage, they were not above playing on the Carthaginian desire for peace to wring some final concessions from the desperate city. When the legions arrived in Africa, the Carthaginians preemptively surrendered, accepting any Roman conditions in the hope that their city would be spared. Here, the Romans began an elaborate ruse, entering into peace negotiations that they had no intention of ever honoring. The consul in command, Censorius, demanded 300 children from Carthage's most prominent families to serve as hostages. Many knew that the children who were handed over would never be seen again, but despite extreme reluctance among Carthaginian women in particular, the hostages were duly supplied. No sooner had Censorius received the hostages than he demanded the complete demilitarization of Carthage. All arms and armor in the city were surrendered to the Romans, and the fleet was burned. But after the destruction of all Carthaginian capacity to defend itself, the Romans then added a final term to the negotiations. They dictated that the entire city of Carthage must be abandoned, and for all residents to move 10 miles inland. This final provision was doubtless intended as a poison pill to the negotiations, a condition so outrageous that the inevitable rejection would provide Rome with the pretext for war. For by demanding the Carthaginians evacuate their ancestral lands and homes, the Romans were severing their connections to the past, their gods, and their ancestors. Furthermore, by moving inland, the Carthaginians would lose all ability to continue their maritime traditions that had been at the center of the city's economy and culture. Even assuming that this was the final proviso in negotiations, or that the Romans would not fall upon the Carthaginians and slaughter them the moment they left the protective walls of the city, a deception that was certainly not out of the question, given the duplicitous nature of Rome's negotiations, the evacuation of Carthage was untenable. Because if it was carried through, then everything that made Carthage, Carthage would be destroyed. The prospect of leaving the city was too grim to consider, and the Carthaginians opted to make a final stand. If their city was to burn, then they decided to burn with it. When Carthage learned that she was soon to face a merciless assault, the city was gripped by a grim resolve. After initial despair that saw mobs hunt down all Italians in the city, as well as the murder of the failed negotiators and all of the nobles who had called for surrender, Carthage began laying the groundwork for a doomed final stand against Rome. Slaves were freed, statues were melted for swords, public buildings demolished for wood and stone, and women shaved their hair to make ropes. Soon, the Carthaginians had produced 8,000 shields, 18,000 swords, 30,000 spears, and 120 warships. For 3 long years, the beleaguered city held out against Rome in the face of a brutal siege that cut off all food from the city. Wave after wave of Roman attempts to seize the city were repulsed, but ultimately, hunger and thirst proved to be Rome's most effective weapons. Hunger made no distinction between combatant and civilians, but neither did the Romans. This was a war against Carthage itself. The very existence of its people was viewed as a threat to the Republic. The modern term for this behavior, this targeting of an entire population, is genocide. Carthage was subject to collective punishment for the sin of its own existence, and the fear that its children provoked in the Roman psyche. When the breakthrough finally occurred in 146, the slaughter was immense. There can be no reasoning with an enemy that is so conditioned by hate and fear. The final destruction of Carthage occurred at the hands of Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the great general Scipio Africanus, who had orchestrated Hannibal's defeat at the Battle of Zama. For 6 days, Romans and the last Carthaginians fought street by street, with the entire city mobilized into a makeshift militia as starving Carthaginian men, women, and children were reduced to hurling rocks and roof tiles at the Romans in a desperate bid to halt the inexorable advance of the legions. The desperation of this last stand is reflected in the fact that of the 700,000 present in the city in 149, only 50,000 remained alive to be sold into slavery after Carthage's fall. Many took their own lives by leaping into the flames, desperate to avoid a life of captivity at the hands of brutal Roman overseers. When the last resistance was snuffed out, Carthage was systematically looted, bringing unprecedented wealth and treasure back to Rome. After everything of value was carted off, the city was burned. It took 17 days for fire to consume the once great metropolis. Finally, a curse was laid upon the site, an outlandish response that was more than simply gloating in victory. It was an indication of just how much Rome feared Carthage, even as the city had been completely eradicated. Cato had died in 149, so he was unable to relish for himself how his fear-mongering had culminated in genocide. But had he lived to see the fruits of his efforts, even Cato may have felt it was a bittersweet victory. For though Carthage was no more, the victorious general Scipio Aemilianus was among the foremost advocates for Greek culture, literature, and philosophy in Rome. Indeed, even as Carthage burned, Scipio realized the ultimate futility of Rome's victory, and that the destruction it had visited upon Carthage would eventually happen to Rome.
Scipio, when he looked upon the city as it was, utterly perishing, and in the last throes of its complete destruction, is said to have shed tears and wept openly for his enemies. After being wrapped in thought for long, and realizing that all cities, nations, and authorities must, like men, meet their doom, that this happened to Ilium, once a prosperous city, to the empires of Assyria, Media, and Persia, the greatest of their time, and to Macedonia itself, the brilliance of which was so recent, either deliberately or the verses escaping him, he said, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." And when Polybius, speaking with freedom to him, for he was his teacher, asked him what he meant by the words, they say that without any attempt at concealment he named his own country, for which he feared when he reflected on the fate of all things human.
As if quoting Homer doesn't make it obvious enough, these were fundamentally Greek ideas, that Rome was not a special people favored by the gods and destined to establish eternal dominion over the world, but merely an ascendant power that would one day fade and reap the destruction it had sown. Cato would have been repulsed by this sentiment, that what should have been the final victory of Roman morality and virtue over a decadent enemy had been carried out by a man who embodied so many of the qualities he hated. Hellenism's victory over the Roman elite was total when even its generals mourned the humanity of their enemies, despaired that there were no gods capable of protecting Rome from the forces of history, and quoted Homer on the battlefield. Adding salt to Cato's wound, Scipio Aemilianus would be proven entirely correct. Rome would eventually succumb, and the city that was once the heart of a continent-spanning empire would be sacked several times, its great treasures carted off, and its monuments reduced to rubble. Rome fell, perhaps not eradicated to the same extent as Carthage, but the Republic, even the civilization that Cato believed in so firmly, has utterly disappeared from history. Though Rome has been an undeniable influence on the states that emerged in its aftermath, so many of its traditions, laws, and practices have been jettisoned that our world and the values we adhere to would be utterly unrecognizable to Cato. The Third Punic War concluded without a peace treaty or ceasefire agreement, as there was no Carthaginian state remaining to negotiate with. It is fitting, then, that in 1985, when the mayor of Rome and the mayor of Carthage met to sign a symbolic peace treaty that ended the conflict 2,131 years after the city was destroyed, that both men represented successor states and nations to the ancient enemies. In recognizing that they had more in common with each other than their ancient forebears, the mayors showed that peace and reconciliation were more powerful than enmity, a final victory over the nativism and tyranny of Cato, for the universalist vision that began with the Greek philosophy he so despised.
Hi, this is Titus from Tribunet. If you enjoyed the video you just saw by Gaius, and if you're interested in thoughtful content that explores the complex culture of the ancient Romans, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.